Welcome to St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church and National Shrine for our Lenten lecture series with Dr. George Demacopoulos. Dr. George Demacopoulos received a Master of Theological Studies with highest honors at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology in 1995 before enrolling at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he earned his PhD in Religious Studies in 2002. Today, Dr. George is Father John Meyendorf and Patterson Family Chair of Orthodox Christian Studies at Fordham University. Dr. Demacopoulos' research and teaching interests are in the fields of early Christian and medieval church history. He specialized in the relationship between Orthodox and Roman Catholics during the Middle Ages. He has published 11 books and dozens of scholarly articles and that focus on a range of topics including monasticism, the papacy, the Crusades, and the construction of modern Orthodox identity. Along with Aristotle Papanikolaou, Dr. Demacopoulos co-founded the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham University, which is the only research university-based center of Orthodox studies in the United States. The center offers an interdisciplinary minor in Orthodox Christian Studies and a host of research-related initiatives that are bringing the insights of the history, thought, and culture of Orthodox Christianity into a broader academic conversation. In 2010, Dr. Demacopoulos was named an Archon of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, Didaskalos tou Genus, Teacher of the Nation, and now serves on the National Council as the Historian of the Order. Welcome, George, a good friend and faithful son of the Church, and has always been here teaching and about our faith. And we welcome you here to St. Nicholas, and we look forward to your lecture tonight.
Thank you, Father. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you. I've known Father Andrea since he was a teenager. He was at the college when I was at the seminary, and we used to actually drive back and forth to New York together. So I remember that time very, very fondly. So it's great to be here. It's my first time speaking at St. Nicholas, which is quite possibly the most beautiful church in the United States. It's really remarkable. I appreciate the invitation. At the service this evening, the reading was from Genesis about Noah, which is very applicable because we have a flood going on outside. It's raining so hard. So I appreciate those of you who came in such torrential rain. So my talk tonight, the title is, Does the Orthodox Church Change? And it's meant to be a provocative title, right? And the answer is, of course. But that, of course, needs qualification, right? And so what I want you to do is I want you to go with me and take all of what you think about Orthodoxy, which is probably all integrated together, and I want you to parse it out into three different baskets. There is what the church proclaims doctrinally about the birth, death, resurrection of Jesus Christ, that God is Trinity, that the Virgin was a virgin, right? About salvation. That's dogma. That's one basket. That basket doesn't really change. It might have been articulated in a different in a process over time, but there is never a time when the doctrine of the church contradicts or runs counter to a previous doctrinal statement of the church. All right, so that's one basket. That part really doesn't change. What we say about Christ, what we say about the Trinity. Okay? Then there's a second basket, moral guidance. what are the parameters, what are the guardrails that the church puts in front of us about how we should live our lives based on our belief in the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus? Okay, that's a different basket. And I'm going to tell you that that has surprisingly changed much more than you think it has. Right? And then the third basket is liturgy. What do we do when we worship together? What do the services look like? How are they constructed? What are they meant to address? That basket, too, I'm going to say, has changed considerably over time, although its change has kind of, for all intents and purposes, come to an end. Doesn't mean it has to have come to an end. I'm just saying, for a variety of historical reasons, the changes in liturgy seem to have stopped. Okay? So the first basket is doctrine, dogma. I don't even think I really need to say much more about it. I can answer questions about it if you want. But we're talking about the creed. We're talking about the creed. We're talking about the subsequent creedal statements of the ecumenical councils. What has the universal church proclaimed about the birth, death, resurrection of Jesus, Trinity, Virgin, salvation, death and resurrection? Those things don't change. I want to spend more time on the moral guidance one because this is the one that I think is going to surprise us. Well, and the liturgy as well. And I'm going to give you 3 examples that I think very clearly demonstrate that for contextual reasons, historical reasons, the moral guidance of the church has changed dramatically over 2,000 years. So my first example is slavery. Okay? At the time of Christ, Palestine was occupied by the Romans. It was a colony of the Roman Empire, right? We see Roman figures throughout the Gospels. Centurions, Pilate, what have you, okay? About 70% of the 70% of the population of the Roman Empire was slaves. Their existence would have been miserable. Okay? Now, what differentiated Roman slavery from, say, American slavery is American slavery was based entirely on race and indigenous populations, right? And so it had this sort of systematic racial component that had absolutely nothing to do with the Roman system. In the Roman system, like all ancient civilizations, when you went to war, if you were victorious, the people you conquered became your slaves. The men you didn't kill in the battle became your slaves. Their wives became your slaves. Their children became your slaves. You brought them home with you in chains. And they would be your slaves, and their children would be your slaves, and their children would be your slaves in perpetuity until somebody freed them or they died. Right? The Roman Empire was extraordinarily successful as a kind of political, military, and economic system, but it was predicated on slave labor. Okay? So that's the system that Christianity is born into. But even before the Romans, the Jews had slaves. The ancient Greeks who conquered the Jews had slaves. The Babylonians who conquered the Jews had slaves. Slavery was an aspect of life simply taken for granted. In the Gospels, the existence of slavery is taken for granted and never condemned. Never. In the writings of St. Paul, the existence of slavery is taken for granted, and with the possible exception of a passage in Galatians, is never really condemned. And it's not explicitly, the practice is not condemned in Galatians. I'll come back to that passage in a minute, right? The early church fathers take slavery for granted. What we don't realize as Greeks and people who sort of lift up the Byzantine Empire as this model, what we don't realize is the Byzantines maintained slavery until the very end. All the way through. They didn't give up on slavery. The Byzantines in the 15th century still had slavery. Didn't go away. Right? In other words, the church never issued moral guidance condemning the practice of slavery. Not collectively. One church author, St. Gregory of Nyssa, in the 4th century, argued, based on the passage in Galatians 3, in Christ there's neither slave nor free, male nor female, Greek nor Jew. All are equal. Based on his reading of that passage, he argued that no Christian should own another Christian, and he released his slaves. And to be sure, throughout the Byzantine period, patristic period and Byzantine period, there were church individuals, there were saints of the church who, upon a monastic conversion or through some other kind of spiritual moment, released their slaves. But it was never the guidance of the church that they needed to do so. I would wager that every single church father, because by definition to be a church father means you have to be educated, because you have to be able to read and write. And to be able to read and write in the ancient world means you come from the aristocracy. Every single church father grew up in a household with slaves. Every one of them. We never think about that aspect of their lives. And even though they were so committed to Christ in so many ways, it did not occur to them that they shouldn't own slaves. Today, however, we would be horrified if any of our members was advocating for the restoration of slavery. Absolutely horrified by it. Right? In other words, as the world changed, as civil society, secular government, the broader culture as a whole came to the conclusion that we should no longer have slaves, the church simply followed suit. Right? It did not lead on this issue. It followed suit. Okay, so that's example number one. Example number two is usury. So that's a word you might not know. It means lending money at interest. Okay? As the chairman of my parish's endowment committee, and as someone who has raised a lot of money for the endowment at Fordham, I am very familiar with the way in which deposit banking, investment banking, and the opportunities provided by investment and interest, right? But as a historian of Christianity, I am also aware that the lending of money at interest is arguably the thing most frequently condemned in the Hebrew Bible. And in the New Testament, Jesus' statements about the matter go even further, right? So you could lend money in ancient Judaism, and in fact you were encouraged to do so, but it was perceived to be immoral to ask for anything back on top of that. Okay? And in fact, in ancient Israel, every 7th year, you had to forgive whatever loan you had. Okay? Now, the Jews figured out a way to sort of skirt that system. They literally created like shell companies so that they could avoid having to, just forget loans, right? But Jesus, when he gets asked about this issue, Jesus says you're not even allowed to ask for the loan back. Right? So not only are you not allowed to charge interest, you're not allowed to even ask for the loan back. You're supposed to just give freely. Right? For the entirety of late antiquity, for the entirety of the Middle Ages, it was forbidden for a Christian to lend money at interest. Categorically forbidden. Several canon laws forbidding it. And then beginning in the 14th century, for a variety of historical reasons, it changed. Right? It started with the Medici family in Italy. They became the kind of bankers to the popes. So it starts first in Western Europe, but then it basically spreads to the rest of the Christian world. And today, even though it is repeatedly condemned in Scripture, and even though there are numerous canons that forbid the lending of money at interest, every one of our churches, every one of our seminaries, every one of our clergy pension funds simply operates within a global banking system that is predicated on deposit banking and investment banking. Because the church, once again, has simply followed the broader culture and decided not to make a point about. That basically said that they've simply changed their moral guidance. That the lending of money at interest is no longer sinful. I mean, sometimes you'll get statements like, don't become a loan shark, right? Don't charge excessive interest, right? They'll try to sort of massage the messaging there. But basically, the church has given up that kind of guidance to focus on other things. The third example I'm going to give is about marriage. And I'm not talking about gay marriage. I'm just talking about marriage, right? Marriage historically, so in the world in which Jesus was born, marriage was a common cultural thing. It ran across civilizations. The Romans had a notion of marriage. The Greeks had a notion of marriage. The Hebrews had a notion of marriage. The Egyptians had a notion of marriage. They each had their own kind of moral guidelines about it. In the Hebrew Bible, of course, the polygamy was encouraged for aristocrats. Most of the saints of the Hebrew Bible had multiple wives. Some of them had concubines. What's the difference between a second or a third wife and a concubine? A concubine is a sex slave. Right? Solomon had concubines. It says it right there in the text. David had concubines. It says it right there in the text. I remember the polygamy wasn't a thing of the ancient past. Polygamy was active at the time of Jesus. Polygamy did not end in Judaism until the Middle Ages. Right? So I remember when I was seminarian, we would read the pastoral epistles where it gives the guidance for the guidelines for who should be a bishop. And in that text it says, if a man wishes to be a bishop, he should be the husband of one wife. And we read that text in the context of a world in which all the bishops are celibate, and we say, wow, they can be married. Right? How and why did that change? But that's because we're viewing that first century text through the lens of the 20th century. If we view that text through the lens of the first century, you realize Paul is limiting them to one wife. Right? He's limiting them because he's inhabiting a space in which aristocratic men have more than one wife. I would make the case that St. Paul, at least in Corinthians, is discouraging marriage altogether. Right? He literally says, I wish that you would be as I am, which is celibate. Right? whatever it is, so the church from the very beginning absolutely has an understanding of marriage. It recognizes marriage. It gives moral guidance for how a husband should treat a wife and how a wife should treat a husband. There's even guidance for that in the New Testament. But here's the thing. There was no religious ceremony for marriage. In the wedding at Cana, what we get of that passage is not a religious ceremony. We only get a party. Because there is no religious ceremony. Because weddings were not perceived in a sacramental sense. In the 4th century, right, in other words, weddings were a kind of coming of age civic ritual. They were neighborhood affairs. They were parties. They were like a coming of age, like a high school graduation. They were arranged. They weren't for love, right? And it was typically only for aristocrats on top of that. There was no ritual. There was no sacrament of marriage. John Chrysostom complains in the early 5th century. Nobody's at church when he's giving a sermon, and that's because they're all at a wedding party. And he has this aside where he says, I wish for once that before the party starts, they would bring in a priest to say a prayer. Because there is no notion of weddings being religious ceremonies. There is no notion of a kind of theological union. There's no premarital counseling. There's no encouraging teenagers to think about who they're going to marry in terms of their faith in Christ. In part, that's because the teenagers are going to have no say in who they marry, right? And in part because there's no religious ritual. The sacrament of marriage is an invention of the 9th century. Right? And the church, rightfully, has now shifted its thinking about marriage entirely. Right? It sees the value of premarital counseling. It sees the value of training teenagers to think of marriage in a certain way. It sees the value in thinking in terms of the crowns of martyrdom. Right? But all of that took the church centuries to kind of work out, to adapt to an evolving culture. Okay, so those are my 3 examples for how moral guidance has changed. Liturgy has changed a great deal over time as well, right? So, for example, as early, the earliest Christian rituals were Jewish rituals, right? In the first or second century, when they're getting together and celebrating a Eucharistic meal, the service that precedes the sharing of the Eucharistic meal is entirely Jewish. They're reading the scriptures, but there is no New Testament. When they're singing, they are singing the Psalms or the Odes of Solomon, because those are the only hymns that exist. As late as St. Athanasius in the middle of the 4th century, St. Athanasius is one of the really big ones, right? St. Athanasius says the only singing that should take place in a church service is the Psalms. He doesn't think Christians should be composing hymns, right? Because they're not biblical. But for a variety of historical reasons, the Christians in Jerusalem, the Christians in Constantinople, the Christians in Rome felt otherwise. And in different settings, they developed different kinds of hymns. They developed different kinds of services. In the modern world, the services that take place in a monastery and the services that take place in a parish look almost identical. I mean, the monasteries might be a little longer, right, because they'll add in extra things, but it looks basically the same. And if the service you celebrated here tonight looks just like the one that they did at my parish on Long Island tonight, which looks just like the one in Chicago, which looks just like the one in Athens, which looks just like the one in Serbia, just a different language, right? But all of that conformity is a consequence of the printing press in the modern age. The liturgy in Constantinople in the 7th century didn't look very much like the liturgy in Jerusalem, right? They were quite different. Dimitri knows all of this, right? Eventually, what was going on in Jerusalem itself, kind of cross-pollinated with what was going on in the monasteries in broader Palestine. And then that got exported into the monasteries in Constantinople, which then cross-pollinated with the cathedrals in Constantinople. And then the Latins came, and then they did a little more. And then the Ottomans came. And then we got the printing press, and boom, now it's all the same, right? Anyway, there's been a great deal of change over time. Just to give, I'm only going to give one example because I could go on and on about this. I'm going to give only one example. So now when we celebrate an Orthodox service, right, the chanters sing what's called a canon. Okay? It's not the cannon you shoot, and it's not a canon like canon law. It's just it's a structured series of hymns, usually about 30 of them, right? Using the different melodies of the church, okay? The very first canons predate the 7th century, but for all intents and purposes, that form of composing hymns that now is the dominant form of hymns that we sing emerges in Palestine in the 7th century. Not in Constantinople, not in Rome, not in Alexandria, not in Cyprus, not in Syria. Why Jerusalem in the 7th century? Why Jerusalem in the 7th century? Because these hymns, this form of doing a hymn, unlike all the hymns in existence at the time, focused on the biblical text itself. And they asceticized the biblical text itself, meaning they encouraged us to read the text in a way that we interpreted the biblical text in such a way that we would live our lives by fasting, by being more ascetic, right? Being more prepared physically, right? In all these ways. Why? Why did this happen in the 7th century? Well, if you know your global history, what happened to Jerusalem in the 7th century? It's conquered by the Muslims. Why now are you focused on biblical texts that emphasize the incarnation and the importance of the scriptures? Because everything you do every day is being challenged to get you to convert to a different faith. And so you're doubling down on your own. And so we have this whole new tradition of singing and this whole new method of interpreting Scripture because the rise of Islam has forced us to do it. Right? And so this is what I mean. Our services were completely transformed by the rise of Islam. The things we are still singing on Sundays, in most parishes, unfortunately, we don't understand it because it's in Greek, right? But the things we're singing were all shaped in the context of Christianity as a minority surrounded by Muslims. And we've completely lost touch with that historical context. Right? Even our Holy Week services, like the book that we do for Holy Week that we know so well year in, year out, it's one of the real jewels of the Orthodox faith, right? Holy Week that's it. Those services as we have them were put together in the 19th century. Right? Let that sink in. There are hymns there that are much, much older. But the structure of the services as we perform them now are an Ottoman era creation. Right? So to return back, does the Orthodox Church change? Theologically, no. With respect to moral guidance, sometimes. With respect to liturgy, until recently, constantly. Right? I'm doing this talk here and at other parishes because I think it's really, really important for us to understand that the church does in fact change. We are so accustomed to patting ourselves on the back by saying we have a faith that never changes. And in one sense, that's absolutely right. But in other senses, it's fundamentally wrong. And when we keep saying something that is untrue, not only are we wrong, but then we run into all kinds of problems when we are confronted with pastoral necessities. And the example I'm going to give is COVID. Right? When COVID came and everybody was afraid, it didn't matter what your political views or what your scientific guessing about COVID says, everybody was afraid. And people like the Archbishop, I would say wisely, started to give pastoral guidance that allowed priests to use multiple spoons. Meet the people where they are. And a whole lot of people who know a whole lot of nothing, right, conflated theology with liturgical practice, with moral guidance, and knew nothing about history to begin with, right? And claimed that he was making a theological error as though there is some theology of a spoon. There is no theology of a spoon. Zero. Right? The spoon was introduced in the year 1000. The apostles didn't use spoons. St. John Chrysostom did not give communion to his community with spoons. They didn't exist. Right? But people got so bent out of shape in that moment with accusations of heresy here and heresy there and all of this, when if we just had a better sense that in fact the church follows, right? The church responds. The church leads. But its leadership is a response to the needs of the people and their prayer, right? And so I think the reason it's important to highlight that the church does in fact change is precisely so that when we do have these future moments, and there will be future moments, or when a new priest comes into a community and does Good Friday a little bit differently, right? The sky is not going to fall because liturgy has always evolved. It has always shifted, right? So that's my talk. I'd be happy to take questions if you have them.
Thank you, George. That was always you don't disappoint. Always have something really to make us think, and good food for thought during this Lenten season. I did want to ask you though. There's this idea that change is a bad thing, right? And somehow it's rooted in our tradition.
Yeah.
There's this idea that change is a bad thing. Where does that come from? I mean, why is it considered that a change is a bad thing, rather than today? We live in a world where we say, well, being progressive, new ideas, new change is a good thing for us. But when it comes to religion, to practice our faith, change is a bad thing.
Yeah.
And how can we understand that so that, I think what you're saying, understand these ideas better and not get caught up in that automatically? I think it triggers people when they hear change. Oh, that's not good.
Right. So I think there's two things going on. One is there's a very old historical reason for this, and then I think it's also part of a more modern phenomenon, right? So the older thing, and I know people aren't going to believe me when I say this, but trust me, I'm a professor, right? In early Christianity in early Byzantium, monasteries were incubators of innovation. Today, we are accustomed to thinking of monasteries as these kind of guardians of a very kind of conservative ethos, a very traditional way of doing things. They're the ones that are going to make sure, they're going to hold everybody else accountable that we're not going to change anything. That switch from being really the bastions of innovation to being the guardians of the tradition, that switch is flipped with iconoclasm. So before the iconoclastic controversies in Constantinople in the 8th and 9th century, whether it's St. John of Damascus or it's St. Gregory the Theologian or the Cappadocians or St. Benedict or whoever, Maximus was a radical thinker. St. Maximus, 7th century, a radical thinker, right? You think today's ideas about gender are crazy. Read Maximus, right? He has all, anyway, these guys, they see intellectual pursuits in theology as something that is a requirement of their faith. But for a series of kind of accidents, what happens in Constantinople in the 8th century with iconoclasm is iconoclasm doesn't really come from a corner of the church per se. It comes from the state. And initially a group of nuns, basically a group of nuns are martyred trying to prevent the removal of a popular icon from a city gate. And then a series of male monks in Constantinople become the kind of public critics of the imperial policy, and they all get sent into exile. So this is St. Theodore the Studite and others in his circle, right? What's that? Yeah, right? And so in the retelling of this historical episode in the 9th century, so the monastics, there were different pockets of monasticism, and they typically argued with one another theologically, but nonetheless, by the time you get to the 9th century and they begin to retell these stories, they now sort of wear as their badge of honor, their badge of identity, the monastic parties in Constantinople, that they were the ones that preserved icons. And so it simply becomes a part of their ethos that to be a monk is to be this guardian, this protector of the tradition that came before. And so the kind of theological innovation of the Cappadocian Fathers or of St. Maximus or of St. John of Damascus, all of that gives way to this new way of configuring what it means to be a monk in relationship to the state. And this is coinciding, I think, importantly, at the same time that the empire itself is in decline. Right? When the theologians were being incredibly innovative, the state was on the rise. Borders were expanding, the money was flowing. In other words, you had confirmation bias that the Christians were right about everything because everything was going pretty well, relatively speaking. But by the 9th century, the empire, Muslims are winning, right? The Christians are almost never beating the Muslims on the battlefield. And so you have these forces coming at the same time. One, the monastics have reconfigured what their identity is vis-a-vis the state and the broader church, and the kind of optimism that comes from a successful state disappears, and now everybody's kind of pessimistic. And so you begin to get these calls within the church that, oh, well, the reason we're losing, the reason that our political fortunes, our cultural fortunes, our economic fortunes are in decline, it's like they're seeing themselves as the Jews of old, that they're being punished for their sins. And so the rhetoric just sort of compounds on itself that, well, if if something's going wrong with the state, it must be because we're not adhering to the proper traditions. Okay, so that's the ancient or the medieval explanation for when that changes. I think in the modern world, I think social media has really, really exacerbated the speed by which little changes here or little changes there are known more broadly. The internet has also, in a really kind of ironic way, led to the breaking of some of the most important very first canons. Like what the canons of the Council of Nicaea, what they actually do more than anything else, the canons of the First Council restrict who can preach where, right? Like when you, Father, when you go to visit another parish, or when you go to another diocese, you need permission of 2 bishops to do that. That goes back to the canons of Nicaea, because they got really upset that when Arius was condemned by his bishop, he went to a different diocese and started preaching. Okay, so that's where that comes from. But my connection to the internet is that now you have, right, and so a priest, so technically a priest isn't even allowed to adjudicate heresy. Only a bishop is allowed to adjudicate heresy. But let's pretend for a minute that a priest can't adjudicate heresy, right? All of a sudden now, because of the internet, you have culture warrior priests adjudicating what is heresy, not only beyond their own parish, which is the only place they actually have authority, but to another parish, to another diocese, to another jurisdiction. I mean, the Patriarch in Constantinople can't blow his nose, right? Forgive me for, being a little crass. Can't blow his nose without some ROCOR priest calling him a heretic, right? And that's just because, so in other words, why do we latch onto it in the modern world? It's because social media has, internet technology, the instantaneousness of information, combined with social media has made it possible to sort of criticize people. And it's always easier to criticize something as wrong rather than to offer something that's right. Right? Yeah. So that would be
Thank you.
The very long way in which I answer
Dimitri, you wanna Dimitri? Oh, he got it.
Yeah. Along the same lines, I 2 things actually. One, if I may ask your answer to this. What do you think is also the impact of Christianity, Orthodox Christianity specifically, being somewhat under siege, just like the 7th century Islamic takeover of Palestine, or the Ottoman Empire basically making Orthodox Christians second-class citizens? Today's secularism, maybe, and also the disconnect, the clear disconnect between state and church.
Right.
So the church feels, or participants, parishioners of a particular parish or church feel under siege. Therefore, we cling to no, nothing changes because we have the truth. I wonder what you think about that. And then one more comment afterwards, which may be unrelated.
Yeah. So there's I definitely think that contributes to it, right? I think as a scholar of religion and the history of Christianity, I'll say that one of the things that happens in the United States, and I guess it's understandable, but one of the things that happens in the United States is people very easily confuse deprivileging for persecution. Okay, so in a society that has a separation of church and state, you shouldn't have any, if that's the path you want to go, separation of church and state, then you shouldn't have any privileged religious tradition. Not privileged, religious tradition. But that's not what happened in the history of the United States, right? So we had this notion of the separation of church and state, but when they created that system, what the founders kind of envisioned was a kind of secularism, but a pronouncedly Christian secularism, which meant that it was acceptable to be one of a variety of kinds of Protestants or even deists, so you don't even have to believe in Jesus, but you are still coming from this kind of Christian mindset, okay? And so, but not Catholic and not Orthodox, right? And institutionally, systemically, the country sort of operated in a way that privileged those traditions. And then the 1960s come around, and you get a different set of justices on the Supreme Court, and you get a different set of representatives in the legislature, and some of them begin to advocate for a true deprivileging of any sort of Christian tradition, right? And that has been enacted in a series of court cases, right, over the last 50 years or so. And, you know, if you're a evangelical preacher and you're looking for a base, it's very easy to tap into people's fear, right, and to tell them that they're coming for you, right? They're going to turn your children into this, that, and the other thing, right? You know, I mean, some of it's honest, like these people feel under threat, and some of it's manipulative. And it just sort of creates this system. Now, that's not to say that the deprivileging of Christianity hasn't had its impact on the Orthodox. Of course it has, right? I mean, our retention of youth in the United States is terrible. It's not as bad as some, but it's terrible. In Western Europe, it's far worse. In some pockets of the Orthodox world, it's actually, Orthodoxy is actually growing. So in a place like Romania, Orthodoxy is growing. In a place like Ethiopia, so if you include the non-Chalcedonians, that's Orthodox. In Ethiopia, Christianity is growing, right? In Africa, Christianity is growing. In Serbia, there's a revival. Even in Greece, I think there's a revival, right? In Russia, there was a revival in the first generation after the fall of communism, but it seems to have just cratered in recent years. So, I mean, again, a long answer to a kind of simple question, but this certainly has this certainly impacts it, right? In other words, people feel that they're under threat. I mean, your scrolling feed, I don't care what you're scrolling on, but whatever you're scrolling on makes you feel under threat.
Yeah, that's it.
Right? I try not to gender my students, but I say to my class every semester, women, your phone is your biggest, the single greatest threat to your life right now is your phone. Right? And, you know, it's for boys too, but for whatever reason, it's not as bad for them. It's terrible for young women, you know.
May I ask one more comment? Actually,
Yeah.
I'm not sure it's relevant to the talk, so maybe you just tell me we'll talk another time about it. In your example of slavery, can I posit something to you and get your feedback as to why the church didn't condemn it? Because obviously that's a big thing.
Right. So, like, to our modern sensibility, it's almost horrific.
But even to the ancient, my sense is this, and the suggestion is this, that we're using the same word slave, but we're not talking about the same thing. In other words, a slave in Roman times could have been a very well-educated Greek that lost the battle, and was in some cases. It was an economic definition. So in other words, today I could say the same thing of a Filipino working in Dubai is not very different than a servant
or a sharecropper
or a sharecropper
or a Russian peasant
or a U.S. Low-income worker. You are stuck at that job for the rest of your life, and at $13 an hour, you will never you will never see the light of day.
Yes.
And so as an economic condition, we still have the same thing, and the church doesn't condemn it.
Right.
Slavery in the modern sense is an abomination because I look at another human being and say, because of your physical appearance, the way you represent God is inferior. Yeah. And that's an abomination that is hopefully much easier for the church to say that's outrageous. So with same word, different.
Okay, so how about a yes but? Right? In other words, yes, you're right, and even the Greek, like when you translate terms in the New Testament, right? The ancient Greek word for slave and servant is the same, right? So it could be translated either way, right? And you can have to interesting effect when you retranslate some of these passages, right? Some of these parables, and use the word slave rather than servant, right? That said, and you're right that you could have a very well-educated Greek who gave you advice, or a eunuch who gave you advice and was led, operated in the imperial palace and all of that. But the most recent evidence, actually, there's really just been discoveries, like they've done more digging in Pompeii, right? This has literally just come out in the last couple months. The scrolls, but also they found these basically underground bakeries, right, where people were working, and they were chained while they were working, right? So, in other words, the people that were baking the bread for everybody else in Pompeii were like basically operating in below ground rooms with ovens. The rooms themselves were probably 140 degrees. They were chained, and they were working 14, 15-hour days, right? There is no way to idealize that or say that it's anything but inhuman, right? And so what I'm saying is, I think it simply didn't occur to the vast majority of them that it could be another way, right? And it took saints like St. Gregory of Nyssa, right, to take that Pauline passage and apply it to the world around him, right? And that's why he's a saint, because he was the rule. Everybody else was just, they don't challenge. If you don't know you can challenge the system, you don't challenge the system.
Disconnect to me on that, excuse me. Is when you think about the Old Testament, core to the Old Testament, it's the Exodus, the freeing of from bondage and all that.
Yeah.
So the concept, you would think, was in the minds of the people, but for some reason it was more mainstream.
Well, but it's also, so you're absolutely right. In other words, the Jews are the people of God, so they should be free, but their enemies should be under their foot. Right?
About the church that changes and the modern times, the social media that we live in, it always occurs to me, especially after the flourishing, let's say, of the social media era, the last, let's say, 10 years and less, that, and I'm making this comment because you touched the subject earlier, we have, let's say, stepping on the canons of the First Nicaea, and everybody now becomes a preacher behind his keyboard or her keyboard. That many times and reminded me the following thing. It reminds me, as we learned back in Greece at school, how during the Byzantine Empire, the crowds of Constantinople will go out and do rioting and do protesting about theological things. And they had the real voice, which actually shifted the decisions of the church one way or another. Are we living something like that hereafter?
That's a really good question. I mean, let me affirm that you're absolutely right. The circus factions, especially in Constantinople, could make or break an emperor pretty easily, right? I mean, even the Justinian, who ruled longer than anybody else, it was touch and go, right? Whether or not he was gonna make it after the Nika riot, and he made it by slaughtering 200,000 people. Are we facing the same thing today? I mean, yes and no. I mean, I do think it's the case that, well, let me give you an example of things that have changed, right? So our largest donors at Fordham University, a couple from Atlanta, they've been married, they're old, right? They've been married 70 years. He's Orthodox, she's Catholic, and neither ever converted. He went to church with her every Saturday, and she went to church with him every Sunday for 70 years, right? They're in a nursing home now. When they got married 70 years ago, they had to go priest shopping to find somebody who would do it. Because 70 years ago, you couldn't find an Orthodox priest or a Catholic priest who would perform the wedding without one of them converting. Right? Today, I'm sure Father will back me up on this, Father, at least 85% of the weddings performed in the G.O.C are what the Archbishop calls ecumenical weddings, meaning only one partner is Orthodox. Right? So, in other words, the Church's willingness to bless a mixed marriage, we don't even think twice about it now, at least not in the G.O.C, because it's what the people are demanding of us. Right? We don't even think twice about it. I mean, we hope that they'll join the same, that ultimately they'll be a sort of nuclear family and receive together and all of that. We don't even think twice about it. Just 70 years ago, you couldn't find a priest in the United States that would do the wedding. For a tradition that's 2,000 years old, that's rapid change.
And I mean, that's very true. I mean, I know we're really
past
you,
time.
but the other thing is also language. I mean,
Yeah.
the change in
Sure.
liturgical language.
Yeah.
So it seems like a lot of times there's the necessity that forces change, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. But and this is what I mean, right? In other words, both moral guidance and liturgy are driven by pastoral need, right? And language is just another example of that. Yeah. So.
Oh, great. Well,
Okay.
thank you,
Yep.
George. We give you a small token of our appreciation.
Oh, thank you.
St. Nicholas.
Thank you.
And thank you so much. God bless you and all that you do for our church.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's right.
Very good.
Yeah. Thank you, Mother.
Great.
Yeah.
Always.
It's good to see you.
Thank you. Good to
Yeah.
see you.
Yeah. Yes, you can.